Managing automated pools with full virtual machines. So, okay, we've got this whole manual mode thing kind of down pat. And admittedly, the manual mode method of deploying virtual machines is, well, as you can imagine, there's a lot of effort involved, right? I have to manage my virtual machines kind of like physical machines individually. Every machine is, well, its own entity. And so if I make a change on one machine, well, then I got to make a change on the next machine, and then the next machine, and then the next machine. And so dealing with manual mode, I said earlier, VMware would love to get you off of manual mode. And some of us have to be on manual mode. I didn't really introduce the whole notion of, well, what if you've just P to V'd everybody's old physical computers up into your virtual desktop infrastructure, and you want to give everybody direct access to the same virtual machine every time? Well, if you do that, you're going to have to do manual mode, because every user has some very different computer than the user that sits next to them, who has a different computer from the user that sits next to them. And so all of that mapping and all of that management of virtual machines just becomes kind of a nightmare. So when you think about this movement to VDI, one of the things you have to think about is sort of the great evolution in just the different approaches in which you would deploy desktops to users. You can think that maybe I just want to take the existing environment that a person has sitting at their desktop and stick it up in a VDI environment, but doing so is not going to be terrifically optimized, right? You're not going to have the ability to constrain those virtual machines down to a consistent experience. You're essentially taking your entire physical infrastructure and just putting it back in the data center on what is probably much more expensive equipment. So this great evolution in VDI approaches actually talks about this kind of steady migration away from the old manual way of doing things towards a more consistent approach. The first step of this is what we think of as full virtual machines. Now, with full virtual machines, what I'm doing is starting with a template virtual machine. So I've got my golden image, just like the golden image I would have in the physical world. And when it comes time to create new virtual machines, perhaps I need to extend the size of my pool, well, then I just create another virtual machine from that template. And so every virtual machine starts out from the same genesis. Okay, back in the days of Ghost, this is pretty similar to how we deployed computers with Ghost. And even today with Windows Deployment Services and the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, this is kind of how we do things. Now, I introduced the full virtual machine approach next, after the manual way, because it is probably, if you're unfamiliar with VDI approaches, kind of the next step in your thinking. Okay, I want to get away from everybody having very different settings. I want to consolidate down into a consistent experience. Okay, well, why don't I just start copying virtual machines as I need them and extending the size of my pool? It just makes sense. And it does until we get to the next nugget. I know I'm teasing you, so for that I apologize. But this nugget is going to talk about those whole virtual machines and how each individual virtual machine is its own entity. In that next nugget, we're going to go one step further with this level of automation and make each individual virtual machine not a standalone independent VM, but just a clone from that golden master. Okay, so you kind of have to understand this process first, and then that will help you understand how things with linked clones get even more automated. Now, also, when you're thinking about this whole process of moving to VDI, there's another thing you have to think about as well, and that's the user and their use case. Okay, back in that last nugget, I told you, okay, well, you can think about going to VDI, but if you think you're going to VDI because you're going to get rid of your local desktops, well, you got another thing coming, because you got to have stuff down at that local desktop for somebody to receive the VDI instance. Well, so that realization should also lead you into the next realization, which is, well, there are different kinds of users out there. There are task workers out there, and there are knowledge workers out there. Or more specifically, there are different types of users that have different requirements for personalization in their whole computing experience. Think about this. If I got a developer, right, and I try to give this developer, who is a fairly tech-savvy individual, who has some fairly unique application requirements, if I try to give them a very consistent desktop that is always the same every time they log back in, every time they make, every time they log out, all the changes are thrown away, they're not going to appreciate that experience. So when you think about what kinds of approaches you'll use in delivering desktops to users, you have to think about the personalization requirements as well. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit later of a nugget. We're going to kind of introduce the topic here, but we'll talk more about it later on. But I want to tease you about this whole notion of thinking about your user and thinking about their use case, because as we start to move into this greater level of standardization with all of these different VDI approaches, well, you'll see how some of them may not necessarily work well for different types of users. So what are we going to do in this nugget? Okay, we've got that manual mode down. There's really, it really was kind of basic. There wasn't much to see there. So now we're going to take in this nugget what we learned in the manual steps and then extend that into this next evolution, which is the full virtual machines. What we're going to do is we're going to prepare a reference virtual machine. Okay, it's that same W7 template that we've used before, except now instead of it being a VM that we interact with directly, it's going to be a template from which other computers get created. We're going to create what is called a guest customization specification, and this has nothing to do with VMware View. This is an entity that lives inside of vSphere instead of the vCenter server that allows you to essentially sysprep that template so that when a new virtual machine gets created, it gets customized to or specialized, it gets degeneralized out of that template form and into a specific entity that's different than everything else. Think of this as just changing the names. There's a bit more to it. I mean, we've got to put the right, license information in there, and we've got to make sure we put the right username information in there. But essentially, this specifies that machine so that we can have different machines that come from the same template. And then with that, we're going to go ahead and create an automated pool with full virtual machines. This is done inside of View, and then configure some of the settings associated with that automated pool. Okay, sound great? So let's go ahead and move over here to our virtual environment. I'm taking a look at vc.company.pri. Here is that W7 template that we've been working with before. Same computer, essentially no different than what we left it at back on that last nugget. And what I'm going to do is log into this computer here. I'm going to do the send Control-Alt-Delete here and then log in with my credentials. I can't remote it this time because what I'm about to do is going to remove the network settings. So there's one thing that has to happen here before we go ahead and switch this thing up to make it as a template. Okay, we've already installed the VMware tools. We have already installed the View agent. There's one last thing here, and if I pump in the command prompt, I need to do an ipconfig -release. This is why I didn't RDP to it. This is why I'm doing it locally. So ipconfig -release is going to release the network information, so release the DHCP address from this computer. That means that when this computer then powers back on after it's been cloned from the template or copied from the template, it'll be able to pull another address from my DHCP server. So I will click to shut down the computer and actually install a couple more updates here, which is just fine. As this machine is powering down, okay, what we're attempting to do here is prepare this computer for turning it into a template. Okay, and we can do that here by right-clicking on the template and choosing Template and Convert to Template. Okay, while the machine's powered on, I can clone it to template, but I don't feel like creating a second copy. Instead, I'll just wait for the power off sequence to complete, and once that power off sequence is complete, I'll just convert that over to a template. So the difference here is just, again, trying to conserve disk space wherever possible. So while we're waiting for that, however, what I want to do is move over here to Inventory, and I want to switch us from the Hosts and Clusters node over here to the Customization Specifications Manager. Okay, remember, I'm converting this virtual machine to a template, and so I can just make copies of this virtual machine if I want, but what I'm really looking for is a way to make a copy of that virtual machine and at the same time specify some changes to that virtual machine. Okay, to make it work as multiple different virtual machines without having to go and remove it from the domain, change the name, put it back on the domain, all that extra stuff that makes replicating virtual machines somewhat challenging. So let's call this a full virtual machine, because that's the type of automated pool that we're about to create. Okay, the target virtual machine OS is Windows. If you have an existing sysprep answer file, you can use it. Many of us do. I want to show you all the different items in here so you can see them. If I choose next here, I'll have to give the owner's name and organization. I'll put in a little plug here for CPT Nuggets. There you go. Both the name and organization there of that computer. Now it's here at this third screen that we have to stop actually, because if you think about it, there's some complexity here. In this guest customization script, we have the ability to enter in a name for the computer as it gets deployed. And we don't want to do that, right? Because we're going to use this customization script to create multiple computers. Nor do we want to give it a name and then just append a numeric value to ensure uniqueness. Because inside of VMware View, as we'll find out in a minute when we start working on building that pool, that automated pool should define what the computer names are and not the guest customization script. So with all this in mind, there is this selection down here called Use the Virtual Machine Name. If you are using this customization script with VMware View, this is the selection you want to choose, because what it's going to do is create that virtual machine and allow VMware View to inject in whatever VM name you identify inside of View. So select here, Use the Virtual Machine Name. Choose the next button. I can put in a license key here, and in fact, I have my little dummy license key that I can plug in here. That license key needs to be a volume license key. Okay, very important. So a couple of things very important here. This license key needs to be one that is either a multiple access key, a MAC key, or an LMS key, a license management server key. Something that is a volume product key that can be used multiple times. Okay, and however your partner is that assigns you your product licenses should give you one that fits for this. If you put the wrong one in, as this one is, and I will change that when you're not looking, when you put the wrong one in, it actually won't deploy the clients out correctly. You'll end up getting an error message. So choose next here, put in an administrator password. I'll put in my administrator password here. You can choose to automatically log on as the administrator if you want, but in this case, remember, we are not attempting to log on automatically as admin. What we're doing here is creating a template specification that will be used for provisioning new virtual machines. Choose the next button, put in a time zone of your choice. We are here in GMT minus, I believe, 7 right here in Denver today, so we'll put in GMT minus 7. If you have any commands you want to run, okay, are there any commands that you want to run the first time a user logs in? Those can set up the user environment in some way or configure certain variables or anything that you need to run the first time that user logs in. Network settings, I will choose typical settings here. Actually, I will choose custom settings because we are going to use DHCP here. However, I need to use a different DNS server address in my case, which is 192.168.0.100. That's just my environment, so don't sweat that in your environment. Your DNS server will probably give you the correct DNS settings. Okay, so this is correct here. Next again, workgroup or domain. I'm going to put mine in the company.pri domain with the username of administrator, or I'll just use my own name here, G Shields, and then my password. Okay. Again, you would probably use some sort of service account in here because you wouldn't want to include your own account. Do you want to generate a new security ID? Okay, the different people you talk to will say whether or not it's important to generate new SIDs or not. And in fact, VMware's Quick Prep does not generate new SIDs. There was an article written a few years ago by the exalted Mark Russinovich from Microsoft, the guy who was in charge of the sysinternals tool set, who said that generating new SIDs is important, or is no longer important. And these days they probably aren't. There are occasionally some applications that are SID-based that can have a problem with this, but you would have to do that on an application-by-application basis. These days, it can be debatable as to whether or not generating that new SID is required or not. And again, VMware's Quick Prep, which we'll talk about later, I think in the next nugget, doesn't actually generate new SIDs for you. So next again and finish, we are ready to complete. So here is that customization specification that we created. Highly, highly, highly recommend at this point that before you try to incorporate this into VMware View, that you use this specification, or that I should say that you test this specification against your template a time or two. You need to make darn sure that this specification is going to function correctly, because Vue does not have as much visibility into this as, well, the vSphere client does. So recommend that you test this before you take the next step. I'm going to switch back over here to inventory and to hosts and clusters again. My template is now powered down. I can verify that over here. It is indeed powered off. And so what I need to do is to essentially convert this virtual machine over to a template. When you do this, okay, notice how it disappears from the hosts and clusters screen. This confuses the heck out of some people because, well, where did the template go? It's disappeared. It has actually moved over to the VMs and templates location. Most of us sit here in hosts and clusters. We need to move over here to VMs and templates, and you can see that this template is now available here in the screen. If you want to deploy a virtual machine from the template, you can do so here. Okay, if I click the deploy virtual machine from this template location, I can create a new virtual machine. Choose the next button, give it a host to connect to, give it a storage location for it to provision to, and then select a guest customization script, okay, right here. Yeah, I'm not going to go through this. As you should recognize, this guest customization script, as you have seen it, will fail because I've put in my bogus licensing information. So I will have to change that before we go about deploying any virtual machines. So test that a time or two. Okay, just make sure that that works correctly, make sure it deploys, and then you'll be good to go. So these are all the steps required to get the virtual machine ready to go. When you are using full virtual machines, that initial kind of starter golden image, as it were, does exist as a template. And I can't stress that enough. Okay, so keep that as a template, create that guest customization. So once you have that, okay, once you've got all the vCenter pieces of this in place, the next step is to put in the workflow, the automation from VMware View. So here's my manual pool, right? If you recall that we created this back in that last nugget. This manual pool now relates to a virtual machine that no longer exists. If I take a look at the inventory, there's that virtual machine that's been provisioned, and, well, lo and behold, VMware View is not aware that, wait a minute, it's not actually there. So be conscious of that. We actually need to delete this original manual pool. Okay, I'm going to remove the VMs from View Manager. I am not going to delete them from disk because I, well, don't want to delete them. Once I've completed removing that pool, well, then the next step is going to be to create a new pool that is a type automated. Okay, let's go ahead and create that now. Here's an automated pool. Okay, this is different from the manual pool. Again, I'm going to be able to use this to automatically create virtual machines when I see fit. Okay, I can choose to dedicate certain users, specific users to specific VMs, or I can choose floating. We talked a little bit about that in the manual mode. It's worth mentioning here that when I was talking earlier about your users and your use case and the need for personalization and how you deal with personalization, remember that mapping a user to a specific virtual machine can be great if you know that you want that VM to always be assigned to that user. And you think about that. When the user's not using that VM, well, it could, depending on how you set things up, just have to sit around for a while. Right? You would have to wait for the user to come back. Well, the reason why I keep pointing back here at the floating idea is because when we get done with that virtual machine, when the user is through using it, well, do we flush all the writes that user made to the VM so that when the next user attempts to come back in, well, they're going to get a clean experience again. I have to think about those user personalization settings when I make this decision. And there are options, as I'll show you here in just a minute, for how you can deal with that. Okay, so we are creating, again, an automated pool now. I'm going to choose a floating pool here. We are going to use full virtual machines. Okay, choose next again. Here, I'm going to call this full virtual machines, and then also give that the display name there. I'm going to put it right back in the root, just like before. And for the pool settings, these pool settings now have slightly different meaning. In the manual world, if I was tagging one VM to one user and they were always all the time mapped to that VM, well, I could make different decisions here. Maybe in that case, it's okay for the user to reset their desktop because it's their desktop. Well, in a pooled situation, if a user resets their desktop, when they go to reboot the desktop, the VM's going to go away and the user's going to, when they reconnect back in, probably come to some other VM, especially in floating. So you have to pay really careful attention to what these decisions are. Because in a floating world where I have automatic virtual machines, well, that user should recognize that they are never going to get the same machine twice. And if they do, it's just, a happy circumstance. Okay? I'll leave these the same here for now because you've seen all these settings. You know what they are. Choose next. This is a new screen from what we saw before. Okay, now we are actually able to, because we're using automated, to choose some of the provisioning settings that are available. First of all, do I even want to enable provisioning? Of course, this is an automatic pool. This is important. Do I want to stop provisioning if there's an error? Probably, because that means that something was wrong, probably in my guest customization script. Now, as you can imagine, well, there's all these items here that the virtual machine naming becomes an important item because, well, all right, well, how many VMs am I going to create? Maybe I'll create 3 today, but I might need 3 more in a month. Do I call them, Bob, Sam, and Skippy? Probably not, because, well, I'm going to have to keep coming up with names. So typically in these automatic naming circumstances, we don't specify the names manually. Okay, you can. Right? You can, as you can see down here on the bottom, you can identify, well, desktop 002 Joe in abccorp.com with the /jdo account. Okay, you can actually do that. Right? That's how you would create that direct user-to-computer mapping. But really what I'm looking for is, in a floating world, not so much mapping a user to a computer, but instead creating some sort of naming pattern. Okay, maybe this is going to be, VM 1 through 100. Right? Well, I can't just put in 1 through 100. You'll see up here that these naming patterns, I can use this specific character string, curly bracket and close curly bracket, to identify what number is going to be associated with this VM. It's just going to be a random number that is guaranteed unique. Okay, essentially, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, if I do VM dash curly bracket and curly bracket, that's going to create virtual machines with names VM-1 through VM-2, VM-3, and so on and so forth. But there may be the circumstance where I want all of my names to be more similar, right? Because as soon as I get to VM-9 and VM-10, the number of characters means the name is 1 character longer. So I can, if I want, actually choose a fixed series of numbers. So n colon fixed equals, let's say 3. That would give me VM-001 to VM-999. Okay, and you can change this to fixed 2 or fixed whatever you want. Again, this just makes sure that all of your virtual machines have the same number of characters. So, all right, well, what's the maximum number of desktops I want to have? Let's just say I have 2 as my maximum number of desktops. I want to provision those desktops on demand, okay, whenever they're needed. And I should always have a minimum number of at least 1 desktop. So I've got 1 desktop that's out there. When a user attempts to connect and they get into that desktop and the 1 is being consumed, well, then there will be 1 spare desktop that's powered on and ready and waiting for that next user. Okay, this makes more sense if I increase the number here. Let's say I have 100 desktops, and I always want to make sure I have 25 up and running, and I want to make sure that I have 10 up and running and powered on but not logged in. Now, why would I do that? You think about it. What are the 2 most resource-intensive things you can do in a virtual environment? Number 1 is to provision a new desktop, and number 2 is to simply power it on. In fact, if you've heard of this thing we think of as a boot storm. You've heard of logon storm? VDI environments suffer a lot of times from power on storms, from logon storms. And what these are is, so early in the morning, right? When users start to log in, that logon process is fairly resource intensive, and all of a sudden my resources start to lag because I'm just simply trying to get enough users logged in. So many users are trying to log in at the same time. So what I can do here is identify that I want to keep a certain number of desktops ready to go. They're already powered on, so I don't need to waste processor cycles powering them on whenever time happens. Okay. The goal with this is to reduce the amount of time it takes for a user to sit down at their desk, attempt to connect to their machine, and actually start to be able to work with it. Okay, I want to reduce that. And a number of, in fact, if you go ask the analysts, one of the number one reasons why many VDI environments don't fail the user acceptance testing is because the logon time is just simply too long. So pay very careful attention to that logon time, because again, you're going to want to make sure that those logon times are not going to create a big problem for your users. I want to put 2 desktops, 1 spare, and in fact, I'm going to put 0 spare. I'll put 1 spare. And then 1 is the minimum number of desktops. I could also provision them all up front if I wanted to. Again, that's a lot of resources required in order to accomplish that, particularly if the number of desktops is large. Now we actually have to identify, well, okay, in vCenter, where am I attempting to go? Okay, the template I am looking for is this W7- template. I can find it because, again, it is a template. I have put it in the right template location. I'm going to put it in the VM folder here. That's just my data center. Okay, I am going to put it in the My Cluster, and then I actually don't have a resource pool created, so I'm going to put it in the root resource pool here. Oh, one thing too, and this is worth mentioning here, this resource pool. When you go and create a very large cluster of ESX hosts, well, let's assume I've got a, 16 host cluster here, lots and lots of hardware. Your virtual desktops may be only a portion of your total environment. Right? Maybe your virtual desktops are one half of the resources. Well, it makes good sense then to constrain those resources into 1 or more resource pools. Okay, I can split the total resources of this environment into halves, and so 1 half is for the servers, 1 half is for the desktops, and then the activities of those desktops are not going to end up being impacted by the activities of the servers and vice versa. That's why it is generally a good idea to put your virtual machines in a resource pool and then to constrain them. Okay, I'm not doing it here. We've got a very small environment, but think about your environment whenever you're doing this. In fact, a lot of people show in the real world, a lot of people will actually create entirely separate clusters of ESX hosts for the purposes of virtual machines, just to keep things separate. Last item down here is data stores. I have VM2 here, which is a 243 gig data store. A minimum of 64 gig is recommended for new VMs. Okay, so this new data store here is the data store where those VMs are going to go. I choose to use the guest customization script that we created. Choose next and finish, and that will be ready to complete. Okay, that'll begin the process of provisioning those virtual machines. So right now, I'm going to pause the recording because I have to go back and fix that license string. I'm going to pause the recording, fix the license string, and then I'll come back and hit the finish button here so you can see what this all looks like once it's all done. And we're back. So one of the things you should be aware of when you're creating full virtual machines is just simply the length of time it takes in order to actually provision and create those virtual machines. There's a lot of file copying required. Think about what a standard Windows 7 virtual machine requires in terms of disk space, and you can imagine the provisioning of new virtual machines takes a pretty extended period of time. So here I am back in the VMware View Administrator after a pretty extensive period of time and waiting for those virtual machines to complete their copy process, even on SSD drives. And you can see here that the dashboard shows that I have 1 virtual machine prepared for use. When you are going about this virtual machine creation portion, when the provisioning process is going on, this desktop status is going to become very useful for you because it will list all of the different possible statuses for the creation process. So it'll start out with provisioning and then provisioning, or preparing and then provisioning and then customizing. And only at the point when the virtual machine shows up in here as prepared for use is that virtual machine really available for the virtual machine pool that you've created. Here's my full virtual machines pool again. And if I take a look at the inventory, well, you can see that one virtual machine, VM-001, is currently available. If I switch back over here to vCenter and then flip back over to my hosts and clusters, you can see this VM001 virtual machine that is now provisioned, ready for use. I can log on, I can see the console here. Essentially, that virtual machine is ready for use by different users. And so this is the process, essentially, of dealing with virtual machines in the full virtual machine scenario. From here, just like before, I can delete pools. I can enter a virtual machine into maintenance mode to perform some activities on it. I can see the sessions that are out there. I will need to identify what the entitlements are for this pool. Just like before, I'll have to go through and add in, so domain users or whomever the right group of people are that should make use of that pool in here so that they can be entitled to make use of the pool. Settings are the same as well, or relatively similar as well here. I've got the same sort of settings that I saw back when we were working with creating that pool. And if I choose to edit the pool settings here, you'll see that I can choose the same sort of pool settings that I saw before. Now, different here, however, are these provisioning settings. Okay, again, this is the same settings that we saw when we created that pool, but these provisioning settings allow me to adjust. Maybe I want to change the virtual machine naming or disable new provisioning if I need to. Same sort of vCenter settings as I saw before, some resource settings here associated with the data stores and where the machines are getting located at, and then also which guest customization script do I want to use. So when you're creating these pools of full virtual machines, this gives you, be conscious of how you're actually going about setting these settings, because as I said before, when we are creating these in a pooled environment where users can get a random member of that pool from any point in time, well, we have to recognize how we want to ensure that those users get the same experience every time they log in. That can happen through roaming profiles. That can happen through a third-party solution that manages profiles. And as we'll find out here in the next nugget, that can also happen through some additional functionality that happens as part of the VMware Composer server. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about how to go through all the processes of managing automated pools with full virtual machines. We talked in the beginning about kind of that great evolution in VDI approaches. Okay, starting with manual and then moving through full virtual machines. And then once we kind of realized, wow, there's a lot of challenges here in dealing with full virtual machines and all the storage requirements for those virtual machines, and then all the time that's required in order to provision the new ones, how, well, maybe this is sort of just an interim step until we get into full linked clones. We talked also about some introductory topics associated with understanding your user and the use case for deploying virtual desktops. We have to be conscious of the task worker and the knowledge worker and the differences between those two types of workers in what level of personalization they may need in their desktops. We'll talk later about how we need to, or how we can implement personalization in that desktop delivery model. But at this point, we've just introduced kind of the concepts of personalization and how that becomes important towards how we deliver those desktops to the user. And then we spent a pretty good amount of time working with that reference virtual machine, converting it over to a template, creating that guest customization specification, and then creating and configuring an automated pool out of full virtual machines. Coming up next, we're going to start working on taking this whole full virtual machine concept and then migrating that over into the linked clone concept using View Composer. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.